out. I was able to get Nico on the phone 5 or 10 minutes after Shams reported the trade. The argument wasn't even between Luka and Nico because Luka and Nico really weren't on speaking terms. Like, as I was pushing him pretty hard on some of the logic of the deal, he has never shown any indication of any regret.
In your mind, talking to Nico Harrison, what was the biggest contributing factor to him making this decision? All right, we've got another special guest today. He's the best in the business when it comes to covering the NBA. He's worked at ESPN for 16 years and is self-proclaimed instigator of the Hoop Collective podcast. Now he's the author of the perfectly timed book, The Wonder Boy, Luka Doncic and the Curse of Greatness. Tim MacMahon, how are we doing?
Howdy, partner. Appreciate you having me.
Of course, man, it's an honor to have this conversation with you, and thank you again for taking the time. Final chapter of your book really highlighted the last calf strain leading up to Luka and the trade. And recently on Ryan Russillo's podcast, you discussed how the dismissal of Casey Smith kind of ruffled some feathers with Luka. With those two things in mind, I was reading your ESPN piece, and you covered the final conversation between Luka Doncic and Nico Harrison about that 5-game road trip. Can you shed some more light on that disagreement, specifically about the 5-game road trip? And when that argument happened between Luka's camp and Nico Harrison, was he actively negotiating that deal with Rob Pelinka?
Oh yeah, no, he'd been actively negotiating it since the Lakers came through Dallas. I think it was January 7th. The argument wasn't even between Luka and Nico because Luka and Nico really weren't on speaking terms. That relationship had obviously fizzled, but Luka's desire to stay in Dallas remained as strong as it ever was. I can't say for certain, but I'm sure in his mind he felt like, hey, I'll be here long after Nico's gone. He was wrong about that, but I don't think Nico will outlast Luka by too long. But yeah, the argument was between Nico and Luka's camp, led by his agent Bill Duffy, and essentially it was there's this 5-game road trip. The target date for Luka's return was February 8th, which was the first game after that road trip. And Nico wanted Luka on that trip. He wanted him to play in what are known as the stay ready games, the games against low minutes players and staffers, guys coming back off of injuries, those scrimmages. And Luka and his camp said, no, he's going to be training at the facility. He can't do 2-a-days if it's on the road and gym time is hard to come by. He doesn't have all the modern medical technology that's at his disposal at the practice facility. He doesn't have the weight room whenever he wants it. The hot tub, cold tub, all this fancy other medical stuff. And they said, if we get that you want him scrimmaging, he'll go, like, if you want him to go practice with the Texas Legends, the G League team, he's all for it. And, they kind of left it at, okay, Luke is going to do what he says he's going to do and what his camp says he's going to do. And the next time they heard from Nico Harrison, it was, hey, Luka's on the Los Angeles Lakers now. We just traded him for Anthony Davis, Max Christie, and only one future first-round pick.
Wow. You had named the final chapter of your book Last Christmas, and that was obviously before that January coffee shop meeting you were talking about. Speak on the irony of that name of the last chapter. And on the night of the trade, was Tim MacMahon doing a little victory lap after all the reporting you had did on Luka's conditioning and the friction between the front office?
I was flabbergasted, even though I've been told, oh, if we got to trade him, we'll trade him. I'm like, okay. No, you won't. I thought they were huffing and puffing. I didn't think they'd blow the house down. I mean, I was completely shocked. Obviously, in the moment, I'm scrambling, trying to get reporting out. I was able to get Nico on the phone, just honestly, like 5 or 10 minutes after Shams reported the trade. I was able to, have his confirmation, get a quote, able to talk to several people, get the Mavericks reasoning for the trade out there. A lot of people considered that me like hammering on Luka, like, do you want to know why they made the trade or not? That's kind of what my job was. And then not too long after, the book did come to mind. The first print run had already happened. So you said perfectly timed. Perfectly timed would have been me able to get that last chapter and all the books that are out there. Now, I appreciate that you've read it. I appreciate you bringing it up. If you get that first print run, then proof of purchase, you can go to the link on my X account and get that last chapter sent to you. But, I knew, okay, hey, we've got to have a chapter in there explaining what the hell happened this year to lead to this, to lead to the most shocking trade in NBA history. And, I knew I was probably going to lead with that scene from his last moments in a Mavericks uniform. And so I'm going back and I'm watching it. I'm just kind of looking for scene. And you watch the league pass, like there's no commercials, right? You see the video from the arena halftime, and I'm like, you've got to be kidding me. As Luka is hobbling off the floor for what ended up being his final moments in a Mavericks uniform, last Christmas, the holiday song about betrayal started playing on the arena loudspeaker. And I'm like, well, there we go. That sums it all up. And honestly, like it was perfect because so much of Luca's, like, you can kind of track some of Luca's career through Christmas performances. Like the previous Christmas, the man had 50 points, 15 assists, and absolutely shredded, the hated Phoenix Suns. What a triumphant moment where he collapses on the bench kind of playfully at the end of the game. And Kyrie, who was hurt at the time, is like fanning the flames, right? A couple Christmases before that, that's when it was Dirk's statue unveiling, and Luca's sitting there watching. And it was a rocky road after that, but he's sitting there watching and seeing loyalty never fades away, and all the love and adoration that Dirk was receiving, and thinking, man, this is what I want for myself. I want to spend my whole career with one franchise. And again, it was a little rocky. They didn't make the playoffs that year, despite making the blockbuster trade, but to be clear, there was fear of Luka asking out if they didn't get it turned around. He never indicated that. He never implied that. It's just common sense fear in the NBA. But, obviously, coming off of a finals appearance, dude, the man was closing on his forever home in Dallas. Um, yeah, like he like this idea that Nico's trying to put out there of, well, we didn't know if he was going to sign the Supermax. Yes, you did. Yes, you did. We all know that. He has said it. And like Luca's, I've seen his commercials. He ain't that good of an actor to make the tears flow like they did when he came back to Dallas. Like it's pretty clear this man was absolutely had his heart fully invested and spending his whole career in what had become his second home in Dallas. And the fear at the end was Nico's fear of making that investment in him, which I think was a bad basketball decision and a worse business decision.
Absolutely. And how ironic was the Kobe piece of this, too? Obviously, the genesis between the Nico and Rob Pelinka relationship, that Black Mamba ideology was all up in part of the reasoning behind the trade. As you said, Kobe's last game on top of it was
Hmm.
when Luka's Mavericks were in Los Angeles. Kobe had stamped Luka Doncic. In your
Yep.
mind, talking to Nico Harrison, what was the biggest contributing factor to him making this decision? Was it that Kobe ideology, or is it something even bigger than that?
Well, talking to Nico, it was the conditioning. Obviously, it was the concerns on the defensive end. But frankly, dude, they were the number one defense in the league for the final quarter of last season and continued playing at a very high level on that end of the floor all the way through the finals. Like they had proven, and then even going back a couple years before that, they were the number seven defense in the league for the season, made a conference finals appearance. So like this coaching staff had proven they could construct a quality defense around Luka. So that logic doesn't hold up. The conditioning, I get. The concern about his body breaking down, I understand. But like that to me, it's outweighed by the production. But we're not even like with a guy like this, he hadn't hit his prime yet, but we're not talking about his potential. He's proven. He's a five-time first team All NBA selection. He's taken a team to the finals. Oh, he hadn't won it yet. Show me the list of guys who by the time they're 25, have been the best player on a championship team. It's a very, very short list. And in all of those cases, they had an all-time, like you can talk to me about Dwayne Wade. He had Shaq. You can talk to me about Magic. He had Kareem. He, so it's a unfair, Kobe had Shaq. And Kobe wasn't the best player, Shaq was. It's an unfair bar to expect a guy to clear. The more I report on it, the more I learn, the more I really believe the fraying of the relationship between Luca and Nico was the primary factor. And now conditioning is part of that. Nico's frustrations with that, the defense, whatever, all these things. If that relationship hadn't frayed, I don't think there's any chance in hell this trade's made.
And bringing up Shaq, it makes me immediately think of that Dumont quote after the trade had went down. I read your entire script of that peaceful roundtable you had with Nico Harrison. By the way, the content of just reading the transcript of you guys going back and forth, I could almost hear it, especially after watching the press conference that was on camera. About that roundtable specifically, why weren't cameras allowed in? Did Nico or Patrick Dumont make that decision on the cameras? And in your 20 plus year career, have you experienced anything like that?
Certainly never have. Like, there's been obviously cases where it's a one-on-one.
Right.
Sure, okay, but never in a case where it's like a group media session. And honestly, I don't know whose decision that was. I know that that media availability, closed door, top secret, whatever. It happened because Patrick Dumont wanted it to happen. He wanted Nico and Rick Welts, the new CEO, Hall of Famer, to get out in front of the select Dallas, the selected members of the Dallas media that were in that room. Um, and I never like, I honestly, I haven't asked like, hey, whose idea was this to not have cameras? Whose idea was this to not allow audio? My whole thing was just pushing for, hey, it's okay if you don't want us to release the audio, fine, but we've got to have our own audio, and we were able to talk them down on that. And it was simply because like I don't trust you to put out a complete transcript. They asked for trust. I said, I trust, I verify. I can't verify without my own audio. And then just the timeliness, like people are going to know this thing happened. We've got to report. It's a 24/7 news cycle. So they did back off. They allowed us to have our own audio, but like they insisted that we weren't allowed to release it. And I don't understand. It's not like the transcript reads pretty rough for Nico too.
Yes. I think it
I'm just going to
works.
tell you.
Yeah. And I think I saw you mention too, wasn't it a week later than it was supposed to be as well?
It was actually a couple of weeks. Originally, they were going to have it the week before Luca came back, and I have heard that Cuban is actually the one who kind of talked them out of having Nico do media right before Luca came to town. So, but it was just the time. Here's the thing: they never did a real press conference after the trade with Nico. He did like the first chunk of Jay Kidd's regular pregame coaches availability, like 10 or 12 hours after the deal was done in Cleveland. Like, come on.
And
That's not, that's,
kid looked like a hostage just sitting there too. I mean, just the optics of that entire
yeah.
thing.
No, but they never like did media availability for the, people in Dallas who weren't there. It's not like the trade happened just before midnight Dallas time to get to Cleveland by, 11 o'clock the next day. Like, that's not realistic for people. And so like the timing to do it was after the trade was done. And then, Nico's excuse as well, we wanted people to see the team that we're putting on the floor. It's like, okay, dude, that's whatever. And then he was going to do his exit interview anyway. So it's just the whole thing. They honestly, dude, they botched this thing from a PR perspective every single step of the way. And I will say this. I don't know how, like, there's not a smooth way to handle it from a PR perspective because it's a irrational, illogical trade.
Yeah.
So, like, the only way for them to try to rationalize it was to kind of dump on Luca. Because
I,
why else would you like? I mean, seriously, like, how else do you explain the decision to trade this guy who's had that kind of production and hadn't even hit his prime yet?
and that flows directly into my last question on the Nico part of this. Has he ever showed a chink in the armor about that deal? Deep down, has there been some sense of regret at all about any aspect of dealing Luca?
I honestly have not seen it. I haven't seen it. He has kept his poker face in regards to that. I would say that he definitely, like, as I was pushing him pretty hard on some of the logic of the deal, he obviously didn't have good answers. But he has never shown any indication of any regret. And in Nico's mind, he kept going back to the 2.5 quarters that Kyrie and AD played together. Nico thinks he has a championship caliber roster, and that injuries are the only reason that we weren't able to see that. Again, I think that's flawed logic too, though. And unfortunately, Kyrie's going to be injured for unavailable for a big chunk of the season next year, and then it's asking a lot for a guy in his 30s. Just like you'd think he's just going to come back and magically pick up right where he left off from a torn ACL. So you can point to injuries as an excuse, but the injuries are also part of the risk when you're basing everything, unfortunately, on two guys who had their own history of durability issues and are into their 30s.
Final question, and this doesn't have anything to do with the Wonder Boy or Nico Harrison or any of that, but I couldn't pass the opportunity to ask you about it, Tim. Whenever the Grizzlies, obviously I'm based in Memphis, whenever they fired Taylor
Hmm.
Jenkins with 9 games left, it felt like, in your words, he was kneecapped last summer whenever the
Yeah.
assistants were let go in the summer. Sam Amick of The Athletic reported that Ja Morant specifically was upset when they let go of assistant coach Blake Ahern, the guy he was closest to. At the time, Amick also said Morant was on Team Taylor until the end. I remember reading your ESPN piece, and you said the internal perception was that players, most importantly Morant, had tuned out Jenkins. What was everything you
Yeah.
heard about Ja's reaction specifically to Jenkins getting fired? And side note, what is ownership's view on where Zach Kleiman stands in all of this?
Yeah, and I honestly I have not spoken with anybody in ownership there, so
Mhm.
I really I don't want to speculate on that because that's I'm not going to sit here and tell you that I have a firm idea of that. I think it's a reasonable question to ask, is what I would say. And I'm sure, we will find out this summer, but I can't sit here and I'm not going to pretend like I know. And as far as Ja goes, it was interesting timing. His hamstring recovered immediately after the coaching change was made. And look, I don't think that Ja wanted Taylor Jenkins gone, or I don't think this was a case of like, Ja pushed Taylor Jenkins out or anything like that. But it was pretty much like everybody in the league, and I'm sure everybody in that locker room understood that Taylor Jenkins was almost certainly getting fired at least after the season. Like you don't replace a guy's whole coaching staff and basically hire his staff from underneath him. Where okay, he's involved in interviews, he didn't make the hires, and then that guy survived. Like that's just not the way it goes. And honestly, I think that the firing of Noah LaRoche, that was, the whole no ball screens, like the very kind of unique, unconventional offensive style they were running. That was Noah LaRoche, and Ja hated it. That's no secret. Ja wants look. He's one of the best playmakers in the league. He wants the ball in his hands. He wants to run a bunch of high pick and roll. Like he wants to, be the engine of the offense. And he hated, spending a lot of time he felt standing in the corner and watching. And so the firing of Nola Roche was seen, certainly perceived as Zach Kleiman basically telling Ja, "Hey, this is to appease you." So, I don't that to me was also the bigger surprise than Taylor. The timing was surprising, and the fact that Kleiman let go a coach who he'd made a huge investment in and turned over the offense to was surprising, but it was absolutely a way of trying to make Ja happy.
That makes sense. Tim, thank you so much for taking the time during the busiest time of your schedule. Look forward to hearing you and reading everything you put out throughout the rest of the playoffs. Thank you again for coming on.
Really appreciate you having me, Jack, and adios amigo.